What is structural racism, and how does it differ from systemic, institutional, or interpersonal racism? When hearing the word racism, many people think of prejudicial beliefs or stereotypes about a racial group, or acts of bigotry and discrimination on the basis of race, like when a landlord or employer rejects an application based on negative views of an applicant's race. This is interpersonal racism. In this scenario, there are four components: racist beliefs, a racist individual, a target of the racism, and a racist act. Racism refers to the negative beliefs or feelings the racist individual harbors. A racist act occurs when someone is motivated to act on those beliefs or feelings. Interpersonal racism is the traditional way we understand racism, but there are other, more complex, and in many ways more impactful forms of racism. One of them is called institutional racism, and crucially, it doesn't require a racist individual or racist beliefs. Institutional racism refers to the ways that many corporate, governmental, or organizational policies and practices produce racially unequal outcomes within those institutions, even though those policies and practices may seem neutral and appear to treat everyone the same. One historical example you may be familiar with is the use of literacy tests as a qualification for voting in southern states. These tests were superficially neutral, but in practice mostly denied African Americans the vote on account of unequal educational opportunities. Today, institutional racism shows up in hiring practices that automatically screen applicants based on past criminal records or require credentials and certifications that aren't strictly necessary for job success. It is also found in certain restrictive voting laws that require forms of identification some racial groups are less likely to have, or in proposals to eliminate early voting on Sunday, a time when many black churchgoers are more likely to vote. Another type of racism is systemic racism, which is broader than institutional racism. Systemic racism describes how racial inequities can flow from one arena to another within a system of various institutions, such as the healthcare system or the criminal justice system. For example, in the public education system, enrollment in underperforming or under-resourced elementary schools may lead to unequal educational opportunities in middle school and beyond, and ultimately contribute to racial disparities in admissions to colleges and universities. Just as racial disparities in health insurance coverage contributes to unequal access to healthcare providers and ultimately worse health outcomes over time. And when communities of color are over-policed, residents are disproportionately arrested and subsequently charged, convicted, sentenced, and incarcerated at rates disproportionate to their white counterparts. This is what makes it systemic. Racial disparities originating in one part spread throughout the entire system. To review, interpersonal racism occurs between individuals and features a racist act motivated by racist beliefs. Institutional racism describes how certain seemingly race-neutral institutional policies and practices lead to racial disparities. And systemic racism describes how racial disparities do not remain isolated within that institution, but can spread throughout an entire system, becoming an even larger problem. Now, let's examine the broadest view of racism: structural racism, which looks beyond a single system to make sense of how entire systems interact. Consider, for example, how residential housing segregation produces racially segregated school systems, because students are generally assigned to schools in their own neighborhoods and communities. Or how high rates of Black and Latino incarceration disproportionately penalize people of color in accessing jobs, housing, credit, and other critical services and opportunities due to laws or policies that disadvantage formerly incarcerated individuals. In essence, Structural racism encompasses all the other forms of racism: systemic, institutional, and interpersonal. It can also help us understand how past discriminatory policies and unequal starting positions can have present-day effects. For example, certain forms of historical housing discrimination, such as redlining or restrictive covenants, suppressed investments in communities of color, and reduced home value appreciation, contributing to contemporary racial disparities in wealth and municipal tax bases. This, in turn, reduces the quality of public services or infrastructure in some cities and neighborhoods relative to others. At the same time, it is important to remember that the larger forms of racism we've reviewed, systemic, institutional, and structural, do not rely on the actions of racist people or racist ideas or beliefs. These forms of embedded racism can perpetuate racial inequality and exclusion even without present-day discrimination. Now, to remedy institutional racism, we must identify policies and practices that perpetuate racial disparities, even inadvertently, and change them. To counter structural racism, however, we must pursue policies that promote racial equity and advance equal opportunity for all. This includes policies that provide public services and goods, such as safe drinking water, quality schools, healthy neighborhoods, housing, transportation, and infrastructure. Otherwise, structural racism will continue. And when systems and structures reinforce inequality and exclusion, belonging cannot take root and bloom. Ultimately, to build a world where all people feel a sense of belonging, we must understand and work together to end racism in all its forms.